All right. Yeah. Can y'all hear me?
Yep.
All right. Just making sure. Yes, it's a pleasure to meet you, Dr. Heiser. I got a few questions that I hope to get to. Uh, General, just keep me up track with the time so that way I don't get carried away.
Yep.
Um, so the first question I have is concerned. I'm sure you're familiar with this particular issue. Whenever you gave a lecture a while back, but like concerning the flat Earth stuff that you've said about the flat Earth cosmology that is mentioned in the ancient Near East back then. Um, what would your advice be to the flat earthers who read or use your material? Um, just simply that knowing that that's just what they're doing with it.
Well, I would say they need to be honest, and while they're articulating the the phenomena of the text, and if they're going to use my name to, you know, I guess I guess if they're doing that, it's going to be virtue by association. They need to be honest and not dishonest, and also inform people about how I think about such things. So, again, I'm not holding my breath that anybody's going to do that, but
Mhm.
that's what I would want them to do.
All right. Um, Next, I remember in a documentary you did, there was a piece where you briefly went over um, the issue about the Noah flood story and the claim that it was a plagiarism from the Epic of Gilgamesh. What are your thoughts on this particular claim? Is it true? And if not, like what what would you say is would make the validity be proven for the flood story in Genesis?
People need to understand the difference between interacting with another text and plagiarism. There are significant differences as well. With between the biblical account and Mesopotamian accounts. And by the way, Mesopotamian accounts aren't consistent with each other either. I mean, they're going to have differences between them. So it's one thing to be interacting with a flood story, at some point, and just essentially copying something word for word, out of it. You don't have, and I don't know that anybody who's a scholar, says something as silly as the biblical writers copied, um, the text. They might say something like, "Oh, here's a flood story," and the biblical writers, kind of liked it, and so they made up their own version of it. And then they cribbed, content off, the Babylonian stuff. I mean, you might have somebody out there in the 19th century, they would say stuff like that. Now it's a little bit more sophisticated, or we're not cursed with pan-Babylonianism. Everything has to originate from Babylon and Mesopotamia. There are elements of the story that are external, have external concerns, to Mesopotamian material. So it's evident that the biblical writer is not just copying, the story itself. Um, that said, there are, I think, within the ancient Near Eastern world, and it's curious, that Egypt doesn't have, a flood story like this, which those who would take a regional view of the flood would find not too difficult to explain, because if it's a regional flood that covered, the Fertile Crescent, we'll say, up into Anatolia and whatnot, then that it would you wouldn't expect the Egyptians to have one. So, given that, I think that the similarity also has to be due to um, sort of institutional memory or collective memory. In the Israelites' case, you're going to have a lot of this passed on by oral tradition. And the way I conceive of this in my mind, because I do think Genesis 1 through 11 is late. It's later than the Mosaic era, and I think that it's reflected by the heavy Babylonian orientation of lots of things in Genesis 1 to 11. So my conception of this is that during the exile, we've already had codified the stories of the ancestors, the Israelites, that they had, been passing down. And I think, again, to me, it's not a stretch to say that they had also passed down creation and flood stories. And so then they take that material that they had sort of quote unquote grown up with, that they've passed around, again, part of collective memory, and then they begin to use that and interweave it with the Mesopotamian material, both to sort of create their own version, but also to be consistent with, again, this thing that everybody in the region would have remembered, their ancestors would have talked about, this great flood. So again, that's the way I look at it. I think we have to account for similarity. I think we have to account for difference. There are places in Genesis 1 through 11 that it is very evident that the writer of the Hebrew material is looking at a Mesopotamian text, because they'll mimic things like the syntax, and they'll change a little bit of an element, to make a particular point, or that they stick to it closely enough that it guides our interpretation of the Hebrew material. I'm thinking about the syntax, for instance, in Genesis 1 through 3. It's very similar to the beginning of Enuma Elish, and if we honor that similarity, then that influences the way we read the first three verses, grammatically and syntactically. So all of that kind of stuff is going on. I think that the picture that in the popular mind about copying flood stories is far too simplistic. It's evident that they were exposed to that, but that's not all they're doing. So in a nutshell, that's how I would say it. Yeah, they're using these texts. They had access to them, the scribes, but what they're doing is not just some simplistic copying it down. Hey, turn the page. I got to finish that sentence. What did they say? That kind of thing. It's just more complex than that.
All right. Next question. Whenever we use the phrase of the ego eimi, the I am statement, Jesus uses of himself. We use this as at least normally we use this as the proof text to point out to Jesus being divine or such whenever he says the words of before Abraham was, I am. Recently I've heard an objection from some Muslims that in the same way Moses had spoke as if he was God by saying he would do this certain thing that seems to be only something that only God did. I forget exactly the verse. General, I told you about it once. I don't know. Maybe you can help.
You could be thinking of Exodus 7 or something, like 7:1 or something. Like Moses is the Elohim.
Well, not just that. It's something that Moses. I think it's in Deuteronomy where Moses says is speaking to the Israelites or to his people and is, saying something to them. In the middle of it, he starts acting like he's God and such, or so speaks as if God without saying, and then the Lord saith. But anyways, they use this to say that Jesus is simply a prophet who was being God's mouthpiece in the same way that Moses was, and isn't really claiming to be God. I don't know if General can figure the verse out on that, but if you're familiar with it, or just familiar with the concept, what would you say to that kind of argumentation?
I need to know what they're actually referring to. I mean, just generally, it's like the deity of Christ does not depend on the ego eimi statements. So I would okay, well, let's take them off the table. Now let's look at these other 12, 15, 20 things. I sort of disagree with the premise that seems to be floating around in the Muslims' head that if we can't talk about the ego eimi statements, then we undermine the deity of Jesus. Well, that's kind of silly, actually, but without knowing specifically what they're referring to, I don't know that I could comment on it.
All right. Well, okay. I still got several others then. So, oh yeah, here it is. So you've talked about the two powers in heaven view before, but also the one thing that I want to know is that along with back then in Jewish thought, was there a view that concerned a concept of like a comparison to the New Testament Holy Spirit? Like, was there any sort of Holy Spirit view that the Jews in the Old Testament or any time in Judaism shared?
Yeah, you do get a little bit of that, and typically it's interchanging God doing or saying something in rhetorically speaking here, in one breath, and then somewhere else in the same passage, the Spirit will sort of fill that slot. So you get a little bit of those sorts of things, both in the Old Testament and in Second Temple literature. And you get these places where if you sort of know the motifs associated with the two powers, and you see them somewhere, but then instead of the anthropomorphized Yahweh, we get the Spirit sort of occupying that space or playing that role. You get some of those things in both, like I said, the Old Testament and Second Temple literature. The guy who's written, I think, most. Let's see here if I can remember how to spell his name properly. Let's see. I'm going to look it up quick here on Amazon. I don't know if it's Levinson or Levison or, let's see. Oh, my search engine's letting me down here. I should probably just look it up in my Divine Council bibliography, but let me just take one more stab at Amazon here. Yeah, his name's not coming up. Let's try first century.
Hey, Christian anarchist, was it Deuteronomy 32 called the Song of Moses?
Could you repeat it?
All right, I found the book here. The Spirit in First Century Judaism by Levison, Levison. And he has some articles too. But he goes through the material about specifically the Spirit in the Dead Sea Scrolls and Philo of Alexandria. And it's stuff like this, where in the Old Testament, the inner direction of a person, okay, is said to be sort of like influenced by God. And God will get credited for the person doing or being a certain, positive thing. And then you'll find some of those texts used in first century texts, Second Temple Jewish texts, where it really doesn't sort of focus on God, the quote unquote Father, but it's actually the Holy Spirit that performs the same roles or tasks. And so Levinson's book is just his research is talking about this sort of swapping in and out of the Spirit with God, and the effect that would have had on sort of deifying the Spirit, making the Spirit occupy the same space. So you get some of that in the literature. My thing is, for New Testament writers, is I don't know if you remember from Unseen Realm, but as the anthropomorphized Yahweh, as the visible Yahweh, the second Yahweh figure is but isn't God, and then all that gets moved over, and Jesus gets put into that second slot. So as Jesus is but isn't the Father, the Spirit is but isn't Jesus. So the New Testament writers will link the Spirit. They will interchange the Spirit with Jesus, and they'll also interchange the Spirit with God Himself. And so that telegraphs this idea that, again, as the central figure, Jesus is but isn't the Father, then the Spirit is but isn't Jesus. And if He is Jesus, Paul says a couple times, the Lord who is the Spirit, stuff like that. And Spirit of Christ will be interchanged with Spirit of God. So if the Spirit is linked to Jesus, and Jesus is certainly a deity figure because He's also the Father, He is but isn't the Father, then the Spirit has to be God as well. And this is actually where you see triunity and Trinitarian thinking come from. But the component parts of that you will find here and there in Second Temple texts, and even a little bit with the Spirit, with respect to the Spirit in the Old Testament. So you get a more fuller articulation of it in the New Testament, precisely because of the incarnation. Again, occupying that center role, the number two slot of the three, if you think of them on a vertical pole. You get a better sense of the triunity idea in the New Testament because of Jesus Himself. But you can't say that the pieces are unique, because the pieces exist in other places. It's just you get this sort of, not formulation, that'd be the wrong word, but you get more development of the thinking of the picture in the New Testament.
Okay,
Uh,
thanks. So see.
Oh, is that all the time?
Well,
I can stick
I'll
around
give you.
for left here.
I'll give you like, Mike. How long do you have, Mike?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm just here
You
by
good?
myself.
Okay. So in this
he's
with-
still keeping Nibiru at bay. He's waiting till we finish. Then I'll have to prop up his paws then, to keep it away. So.
right. So Mike, in the side chat, you can see I posted the verse that CA was trying to get at, and that's Deuteronomy 29, verse 5 to 6. So CA, maybe if you want to come back and showcase the footnote that I put from a commentary saying you have a change in persons and so on. Yeah.
Well, if there is a change in person, I mean, the note you put in here sort of answers the question. So how can it be Moses if it's the Lord? I don't.
Right. The claim by so we actually had a discussion with a Muslim that basically said, oh, look, here's an example where Moses is speaking,
Mm-hmm.
and then suddenly he says, I am the Lord your God that did this. It was a bit sloppy, and so what I did was I looked at a few of the commentaries, like this one, the Expositor's Bible Commentary, and clearly in the footnote it says, well, there's an abrupt change in person indicates that these verses are spoken by the Lord. But I was looking at some other commentaries, like I think the Anchor Yale commentary says that it could actually be Moses speaking on behalf of God, like, and so maybe CA is wanting closure on that. Like, what's the best way of reading that?
I think either is a possibility. Deuteronomy, again, some of this is reflective of what one thinks about the authorship of Deuteronomy. If you take a phrase, let's just look it up here. So you have the phrase "I am the Lord your God" shows up a bunch of times, over 40 times, and so someone who would you don't have to be a source critic. Again, I'm what used to be called a supplementarian. That I don't think all of the 5 books of the Torah were written at the same time or by the same person. Even though I believe in a Mosaic core to what we identify as the Pentateuch, and I think JEDP is, again, a lot of circular reasoning there. But anyway, if you have this phrase exist prior to the writing of Deuteronomy, and then you have someone fashioning Deuteronomy 29, and they word the text the way it's worded, where Moses is talking and he says, I am the Lord your God. They're going to assume that their readership is going to know that phrase exists somewhere else, and they're going to assume that their readership knows who the speaker is. So it can exist as it is. You don't have Moses claiming to be deity, but what you have is whoever wrote or edited the text is just operating under the assumption that people will know what's being referenced. The earlier, really it's the Exodus. It occurs in Exodus 6, for instance. And most people, who are source critics would certainly say Exodus existed prior to Deuteronomy, but you have a bunch of other ones too. Exodus 16 is another, and again, it's very, very close to the same time. But the phrase itself is linked to the deliverance from Egypt. So I am the Lord your God. Everybody's going to know because it occurs so much, and it's connected specifically with the deliverance, from bondage, that they're going to know what it refers to. So I don't think that's a long way of saying that an Israelite, a Jewish reader, is not going to be reading this text and think like a Muslim, like a 21st century Muslim. They're going to know where the phrase originates from, and they're not going to be confused by it. But like the commentator that you posted, you could certainly argue that as well.
And so just quickly, Mike, is the New International Version, like even the 2011 edition, it actually starts by saying, yet the Lord says in verse 5. But obviously that's not in the Hebrew text. And so and emphasize that it is God speaking, as you see in verse 6. But so
Do they-
is
does
it
the-
Moses speaking, or
Does the NIV have that in italics? I'm just wondering what the NIV does to indicate
no,
translation.
no, it literally
That's kind
has
of interesting.
capital lords there. Yeah.
I don't even know if I have NIV 2011. I'm trying to. That's not today's NIV, is it?
No. The NI, yeah. The 2011. I mean, if I go to the 1984 one,
Yeah.
it doesn't
What's
have
the
it.
1984 one do?
The 1984 doesn't have it, but the 2011 does.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, well, that would be a translator decision. If there's no, I'm going to look up. I have something called SESB here to see if they have a note here, if there's any textual validation to that. So this is talking about verse 5 in English. During and 1984 says, this is the NIV 1984, during the 40 years I led you through.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So
the Hebrew text
sorry, go ahead.
has, the Hebrew text has, at least what the SESB has a critical apparatus. And so that's showing, and I said, so it's not an and he said, but if the translator was looking at that and I said, and then, again, noting the earlier places where this same phrase has shown up, I'm trying to be generous here. Could I don't need to be generous to the NIV translators, but I'm just wondering. I'm wondering on what basis they made the decision. And it may have been something like that. They may have thought that legitimates what they're doing, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I was serving a lot of translations, and it seemed to have been literally just this one.
That Bible has. Did you look up Net Bible on that?
I forget. Let me just check Net.
Yeah, they don't have it. They don't have anything there either. Yeah.
Yeah, Net doesn't have it.
And which was the commentary that you posted the note from?
So this is the Expositor's Bible Commentary by Earl S. Carland.
Mm-hmm.
But the Net Bible does have a footnote that says the Septuagint reads that He is the Lord your God.
Yeah.
In verse 6. So instead of saying that I, because again there's this notion of if Moses is speaking, it's like interesting that the Septuagint like changes the I to a he.
Yeah, well, you get stuff like that a lot. Yeah. And that's at 29:6.
Right.
Again, trying to be generous to the NIV translator here. I obviously don't know who this was, but it could be again that they're taking. That's really interesting. Because I could see where somebody could look at the Septuagint. Okay, he is the Lord your God, and maybe think that there's justification for changing the beginning on the basis of that. I don't know. It's hard to know what they're thinking. It's in Tige in his Deuteronomy commentary. I just looked him up here. He says here, Moses speaks for God as in 28:20 and elsewhere. As in 8:2-4, God reminds Israel of his providence and the wilderness had an educational purposes. So if you go to 8, 2 and 4, and this is a good point on Tige's part, there are going to be places in Deuteronomy that take the same material where there is no quote unquote confusion, and so it's very easy to re-reference those places. And I was referring to other parts of the Torah, but here Tige has an example. Right from Deuteronomy, where again the reader's going to know what's going on. They're going to know that Moses is mouthing the words of God and not claiming to be God. So I'm not under any delusion that's going to satisfy a Muslim, apologist. But again, people who are reading through the text, especially closely, aren't going to be confused by it. But now I'm really interested as to why the NIV did what they did. Yeah, I don't have a copy of that, the 2011 version.